There's a lot of overwhelm with supplements. And one is a lot of the different ingredients out there, a lot of different supplements for what are actually proven and what really works versus what doesn't work. I think there's a lot of like switching that's occurred in people's brains too. People are really confused about that.
I'll start and I'll make a list of, okay, these are like the 90 things I know of that are used, you know, in one way or another. The way I would approach it, so let's say like turmeric, right? Super common. Yeah. Then I'll find every at least human study on that, kind of grade them, for lack of a better word, right? And at the end of that process, turmeric, there's been an extensive amount of research. And then I'll, all right, what, like 1 to 5, what would I rate it? 1 is, like in our marketing, people would have heard this. That's Greg's LOL. Like, I can't believe anyone would bother taking this and spend money. 5 is like, okay, this is a legit, star thing for at least this application. I would expect it to help most people.
Thank you so much for joining me today on Extend to talk all about supplements.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me here in your office to do this podcast live, person to person.
Thank you. And you've had a lot of experience in the supplement world. You're a scientist. You tell us a little bit about how you arrived into this world, a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so I started out as an officer in the Navy, would have graduated with an engineering. Oh, great.
Yeah, I was an officer too.
In 84. Okay. But I was always the weird officer, like that tried to stay in shape and did things like that. And then I got out in September of 89. And my last year, I knew I was going to get out. I had to basically give almost a year's notice at that point to get out. And my plan was to be a gypsy and just get rid of everything, except a backpack, wander around. It would have been the first time I wasn't in a regimented thing, between growing up, college, and then Navy. And it occurred to me there, like, I should at least know some basics about taking care of myself. And, stumbled on books that it was the first time I encountered in those books things like acupuncture and herbal medicine. And so I thought, I should, get smarter in this, right? So I started reading things on my own, decided to stop in Hawaii. Asia was my planned first stop. And I thought Thailand. So at the University of Hawaii, I decided, I'll just take some like Thai language course, see if I can find anything related to herbal medicine or, like self-care, and ended up applying and getting a grant to do a master's degree in Asian studies with Thailand as my expertise. Okay. So that was, 90 to 93, still like preparing, and got to Thailand at one point to study there. And in that time period, I stumbled upon naturopathic doctors in Hawaii and thought like, they're actually living and doing all these things I'm trying to piece together on my own. And so shifted gears. 93, I was in the first class at what's now called Sonoran University in the Phoenix, Arizona area.
I know a lot of graduates at Sonoran University.
Yeah. So I was in the first class. We were actually in Scottsdale at that point, in a little elementary school. And so then I learned about supplements obviously during my naturopathic program, but in 95, Thorne, which is, a massive company now, they were still owned by the founders, decided they wanted to have a student rep in each of the naturopathic schools and picked me. So my last year in naturopathic school, I started to go to trade shows and be the person at the Thorne booth and sit in at the lectures at A4M and environmental medicine conferences and, a lot of the big ones. And then worked for Thorne my first year out of naturopathic school before going into practice. So I guess I've been inseparable from supplements, and even before, like going back to the Navy, I was someone that aspired to be bigger than I think my genetics allowed for. So I would read I don't know if it was muscle or in fitness or one of those. Yes. And there was always supplements. So in the Navy on the ship, if you were to open the medicine cabinet, a whole shelf would have been like the L-carnitines and the anything that was buzzy in that mid to late 80s.
Yeah, back in the 80s, it was like if you went to the gym, you had at least 10 bottles of supplements in your house. And, you were at the supplement store on a weekly basis buying things. Yeah. I remember that whole gym culture from the 80s. It was very supplement driven.
And the research on things back then was, compared to now, like it was more story, right? But I remember taking arginine and carnitine. And this was way before like creatine and HMB and some of the things that actually work really well.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the stuff was mainly just, someone else at the gym told you what they were taking and they looked better than you did, so you might as well take the same thing. And so I got a lot of education in supplements just through that.
Yeah.
And in probably the same way you did, and exposure to it. But then you realize when you start doing a deeper dive, quality, research, all these things matter.
Yeah, and it was, I feel fortunate my, start after naturopathic school or even was with Thorne because, at the time, the name was actually Thorne Research, and they were a very, science first, evidence based brand compared to some of the other ones that existed in that, mid 90s.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, Thorne and a few of the other companies, they really made it their mission to make sure they had quality ingredients that had a lot of research behind it. And so then as a doctor, I had heard those names through my gym days as being science focused. So then when I became a physician, those are the supplements that I used in my practice. So it was a really good idea for them to be so science based.
Yeah. And, it was interesting because they were a doctor only brand at that point. And the world's blurred since then. There's relatively few now doctor only brands, but
everything's on Amazon now too.
But I don't know the current iteration of Thorne well, but I knew the founders really well, and it was an interesting time in the supplement world because a lot of the brands, the owners still owned the brand.
Yeah, exactly, and supplements became huge, and basically from '80s up till now. Now it's a major part of the whole medical health and wellness world. And there's so many different supplements out there. And I think there's a few things I want to talk to you about today, which is I see patients as a physician still on a daily basis, and there's a lot of overwhelm with supplements on, I would say, 2 or 3 different aspects. One is a lot of the different ingredients out there, a lot of different supplements in what are actually proven and what really works versus what doesn't work. I think there's a lot of like switching that's occurred in people's brains too. But you hear one day resveratrol is the best thing ever, then you hear this is not the best thing ever, and people are really confused about that. I think the second thing I would love to get your opinion on too is also ingredient quality and supplement quality. I think a lot of people become very skeptical. What do they believe and why should they believe it? And then lastly, this whole longevity space, and there's so much new research and ingredients that are coming out in the supplement world specifically around longevity. And I'd love to take a deeper dive into that with you as well. And I know Qualia started off first as a nootropic supplement company, which is where you are now, but also now very much focused on longevity space as well, which I think is smart for Qualia. But I know you guys are very research focused as well. And I'd love to talk to you about some of the research there too.
Yeah, I would love to let's do a deep dive into all those things.
Great. So let's first talk about the number of supplements out there. And so when I see people, I always refer to like this bell-shaped curve, right? You have in the middle of the bell-shaped curve, you have most people, which I would say to the right of the bell-shape, this average are people that are willing to take supplements that are tried and true, but also a few others that don't cause any harm, but might have some specific benefit. And then to the left of that is people that just want just what's tried and true. They'll take maybe 4 or 5 supplements that are just key supplements that they know everyone should be on. But then you have the people on the outsides, right? You have the people that are maybe one standard deviation away from that are like, let me know, I'll take 10 to 12 supplements, but I want to know that they work. I want good quality. Then you have, of course, the people on the way outside that are like, tell me everything that Brian Johnson takes and everything that Huberman recommends and Atia recommends to put into my supplement protocol. And so, I find most people are probably in the middle and willing to take a little bit more than just the tried and true stuff, right? And so I want to first focus on what do you believe is the core supplement choices or ingredients that people should take just for day-to-day maintenance, the tried and true supplements. And then I want to start talking more about what are the ones that you believe are kind of additive to that you take or you think most people should look into taking. So what are your core supplement stack?
So I think the way so I read a lot of research papers.
Yeah.
Like if Qualia is doing a new products. Say we're going to do joint, I'll start and I'll make a list of, okay, these are like the 90 things I know of that may, are used, in one way or another. And then the way I would approach it, so let's say like turmeric, right? Super common. Yeah. Then I'll find every at least human study on that, read them all, kind of grade them, for lack of a better word, right? And at the end of that process, turmeric, there's been an extensive amount of research as an example for joints. And, that particular document is probably 95 pages that I've done. And then I'll, all right, what, like 1 to 5, what would I rate it? 1 is like in our marketing, people would have heard this. That's Greg's LOL. Like, I can't believe anyone would bother taking this and spend money. 5 is like, okay, this is a legit, star thing for at least this application. I would expect it to help most people.
And so you put together a 95-page document just on like one.
Just on turmeric.
Just on turmeric.
Like some other ingredients, maybe it's 8 pages because there's not as much research. Turmeric, I mean, there's probably 12 branded ones that they've all funded some studies. It's, turmeric, I would say, good for that, but overrated.
Right.
And the amount you need is high, right? So it's, capsule count creeps up.
Yeah.
So all those things get into consideration, but at the end of the day, for like, joint health, turmeric, it would have a rating 1 to 5. It's 4.
It's 4.
But some of the types would maybe be a 4.5, others would be a 3, right? Like they're not all the same.
Right.
So that's the way I would approach it. And at the end of like a joint project, we'll have graded like the quality team, in this case, maybe 80 different ingredients. There'll be a whole bunch of 2s and 3s, and that doesn't mean they might not be useful, but they better be inexpensive because they're a niche role in a formula. There'll be maybe a handful of 4 and 5s. And what invariably is the case, whether it's nootropics, joint, gut health, there's a group of things you can say are like overrated, like the
LOLs.
Yeah, the buzz they've got on whether it's social media, influencers, long history in the supplement industry. They're thought to do better than research shows they do. There's another group that's properly rated that, like whatever the public and doctors, et cetera, think about them, they're pretty on the money. And then, often a subset that are either underrated or relatively unknown. So because of that, they're underrated. And then, the next step for me, if I'm making a product, let's get pricing on things and then like value. Do these things, maybe something in my hierarchy is a 3.5, so not nothing, not a rock star. If the contribution it makes to the product is such that it's going to take up, say, 20% of the ingredient costs, but it's going to be like 3% of the benefits, probably not worth it, right? So all those things for me factor in when I'm going through the formulation process. But the first thing is picking out the things that really work.
Yes.
Right. And so, we happened to mention it before we were filming, I think, but maybe it came up in the Navy, magnesium. So magnesium's a thing. Magnesium. Many people don't have quite as much in their diet as they need. Stress is an example you would know. It's called the stress magnesium vicious cycle. But when we're under stress, our cells dump more magnesium as a coping mechanism. But as they get depleted, they respond poorly to stress. So it becomes this, vicious cycle.
Sure.
And there's lots of things like that with magnesium. And the other thing, I wasn't as aware of this until fairly recently, but we would have historically probably got 20% or so, 15 to 20% of our intake of magnesium in water. But now because, much of our world does things to purify their water because of other reasons, we're also losing all the minerals, including magnesium. So my sense is magnesium, 1, it really works.
So it's a 4 or 5?
Yeah. For the things, like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that
for
it's
things that is meant to work for.
As well known, it's still probably underrated how important
I would
it is,
agree.
right?
I would agree.
So that's how I just tend to think of things. Like creatine as an example for lots of things. It's mostly muscle, like sprint type weightlifting, like because it accumulates in muscle tissues. We probably evolutionarily got a lot more than most of us get in our diet. So our tanks aren't saturated. And, more recently it's, becoming more and more recognized as an important nootropic, something for the brain. So that's like, that just works, right? It's, a great thing that's, again, as widely used, probably underappreciated for how beneficial. So, and so that's my lens for how I approach things. Like, what does the research say?
Yeah.
How would I parse it? And then at the end of the day, my goal when we release a qualia product is that, that particular formulation or recipe actually does what it's supposed to do. Because the most expensive supplements are the ones that you're paying money for and aren't doing that.
Exactly.
And so because that our last step is always we do an open label pilot study, and often on a couple different recipes to see if one stands above the rest.
I love it.
And if that's the case, then all right, we'll launch a product. It's why we don't have a lot of product, because we put a lot into the development and the research before you would ever see one of our finished products.
Yeah, you're very mindful about the products you put out, because I could tell it's not like you have this massive catalog and it was developed over a couple of years. It's very few products developed over a long time as I've been tracking the company. So I really do appreciate that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on this show, because I know there's a lot of time, energy, and care put into the products that are out there. So on that note, you mentioned with magnesium as an example, you're looking at the efficacy of the ingredients for what they say that it's used for, and you have that 1 to 5 rating system, but you're also tying cost into that. And so that's really important too, because like you're saying, if something costs a lot and gives you very little benefit, it's probably not worth taking, right?
Yeah, so I'm sure you would have patients like this, because I did when I was in practice in the Greenwich, Connecticut area. I had some people from Manhattan. In a general sense, money was not an object. I remember I had this one client that I think, say, every 3 months they would come back in, and they were spending $2,000 easily on supplements from our clinic. I'd always try okay, what can we strip away? What's less important? And it would be this incredibly hard negotiation to get anything removed. They wanted and relied on everything, right? But they weren't the norm. The norm was what you had talked about in the bell curve, that most reasonable patients I had from that part of the country, maybe 3 to 5 separate bottles. So what are the best 3 to 5 for you was my job to figure out. And often, that some of my patients were people that were healthy and just wanted to stay healthy. So that would, be a separate kind of thing. Others, it was for a very specific reason. And so, I think, my tolerance is more than the 3 to 5, but it's not, some of the people I, know let me just take these 2 handfuls of supplements. I'm not that person either.
It's like a meal of supplements every meal.
Yeah. So
a handful every meal.
So I would tend to think like my job as someone that's making products for people that will buy qualia products is I want to make sure, one, we create products that for that use do what we would say they do, right? That really work. And then to make those decisions about, what's delivering real value for our customers, because I know they won't have that ability.
Right.
And so that I just view that as part of my role, like, you and I do for patients when we work with them.
How many different ingredients have you looked at in this way? You said you wrote a 90-page report on curcumin. How many different ingredients have you done these reports for?
Hundreds.
Oh my gosh! So you're a massive expert. So this is fantastic to have you here.
For each project, like when we launched Qualia Symbiotic, that would have been probably 70-ish ingredients. Different probiotics, different prebiotics, a whole bunch of botanicals, miscellaneous things like your butyrates. And then, that's a scoopable powder, so it had to taste good. So certain things like love the ingredient, just can't work in that form factor.
Yes.
But, it's surprising how much ends up in my rating at 3-ish, which is not not nothing, but just not a rock star.
Yeah.
So it often, by the end of a project, the list of things I feel really that I would want to take and build a product around has narrowed quite a bit.
Got it.
And then whether it's nootropics, a joint formula, we'll have developed that same approach to everything. So,
I like it.
We have, I would say in many respects, maybe, the most exhaustive, reviews that I'm aware of for ingredients. We don't publish those or put them customer facing because there's a lot of things that would be non-compliant verbiage in them. So.
Right. No, makes sense. So on the category of the healthy patient just wants to stay healthy, they only want to take 3, maybe 5 bottles. What are those 5 core things that that person should take?
So for me, I always start first and foremost with the gut and the brain. Like I think if we have those things working well, many other things fall into place.
Okay.
So so nootropics, for the brain, I think are, that's the general category. And for people not familiar, nootropics originated as a term from a Romanian chemist and pharmacist that was trying to create a GABA-like compound to help with sleep. What he created was paracetam, the original racetam, which doesn't at all help with sleep, but when he gave it to animals, they behaved smarter, right? So he spent a lot of time researching that, eventually coined the word nootropic, and it was, Romanian is a Latin language, but he was using really a French word, and it translated kind of as mind-bending. But we'd now maybe think neuroplasticity, something to do with plasticity.
Yes.
And so nootropics really, again, almost any of the cognitive areas people care about. But when I think of the big 3 things nootropic users usually want, it's more energy, more motivation, and better focus.
Right.
So everything else after that is like memory. Sure, we want that. Yes. We better mood. Yeah, we want that too. But a good nootropic product needs to do all those things. And then ideally, for me, I take all the Qualia products too, and I want to take them. So I want, things in there that I want to take long term as well. So for the brain, I think Qualia Mind is by far the best nootropic out there, and that would be a core for me. And a use that if I was still in practice with patients that I would use it for that I don't think people appreciate is naturopaths were maybe infamous for long initial visits, taking a big history, and then asking people to change massively.
Yeah.
Like change their diets, change their exercise, do all these supplements, meditate, whatever, right? And when we're asking the brain to do more, it needs more resources, simply put. Long story short, or like an analogy, if someone in this room was really good at playing the piano, their brain would really efficiently play the piano. They would take very little ATP, brain energy to do that, right? It would have been burned in to the circuits. I've never played piano. My brain, to play the piano very poorly, would require a lot of energy, right? And why that's important, anytime we're asking the brain to do something new, which is what we're often very much asking of our patients, their brain needs more resources than you and mine because our brains already know how to do those things. Yeah. So that's why I said I always start with the brain.
Right.
Because when we're, the main thing that gets people healthier is changing habits.
Yes.
And change requires more energy, more resources. So I would always start with the brain now.
So what you're saying is that the flip side is also true, that when your brain is being asked to do something new, which for many of us, we do a lot of new things every day, it actually needs more energy. And so the nootropics can help provide the neurons with the energy they need to make new habits or do new things.
Yeah. So that's like creatine. I think people's, the reason I think creatine is good for the brain is because it's an ATP buffer, right? The phosphagen system. So, wouldn't be my go-to for that, but a big part of paracetam. If you had asked that researcher back in the early 70s, well, how does it work? One of his originally published papers was, it seems to allow the brain to make more ATP.
Got it.
So, a lot of nootropics would have that woven in somewhere in their mechanism. Now, some of the other things they'll support blood flow because you need to get the blood sugar and the ketones or whatever, to where they need to be. to be well used. And then, some have to do with balancing neurotransmitters and things like that. So that's, when I think of, okay, let's make a blend of things or a recipe or a full formula like Qualia Mind, the goal is like supporting all these different things. Let's support, dopamine, acetylcholine. Those are dopamine, simply put, motivation.
Yes.
Acetylcholine, without that, there's no neuroplasticity. Right. So it's, very important for changing the brain's landscape, right? For I remember seeing someone say something like, without acetylcholine, 10,000 hours would be wasted.
I
right?
like that. Yeah.
So then all of those things need to be supported to have a really comprehensive approach to supporting the brain. And, I'm 62 for listeners, right? They might have figured that out given my Navy timing. But, I'm cognizant of, like brain aging. I want someone that takes the Qualia products to have a healthier brain 6 months or a year from now than they do today.
Right.
And there's things like lutein and zeaxanthin that are commonly thought of as vision, which they are. They're rock stars. They're 5 stars for vision.
5 stars for vision, yeah.
But they're also 5 stars for memory and some other long-term brain areas.
I did not know that. So the product, the Qualia Mind product, is a blend of ingredients that you consider 4 or 5 stars put together to really promote a healthy brain. And so I think, there's a misconception around nootropics where they're really for the person who's trying to achieve a short-term focus for something. Like maybe you have a test coming up and you need it for that, or you have a speech coming up that you need to be on stage. And I think a lot of people have a bottle of nootropics at home and they only use it for those days where they need to perform versus what I take it for instead, what I take nootropics for is to maintain long-term brain health, specifically as we age. Like you said, I'm 52 and these things concern me. I want to maintain long-term memory. I want to maintain long-term focus. And so I think of it more as a brain health supplement versus for a specific time to perform a specific function. Is that correct?
That's how I think about it, right?
Okay,
and it's how I approach Qualia Mind, and it's one of the reasons. So I think of it yes, but and yes, and. So like the first, I just want the nootropic for a day like today. So I drove up from San Diego here to your studio. I'm not on the road very much. I live by the beach in San Diego County. Today I'm asking my brain to do more than normal, right? So like one use case.
Driving through LA traffic, that takes a lot of brain power.
Yeah, thank God for my Apple app that's telling me how to get here. So, but so that would be a use case, right? Like I'm asking more for my brain. I want it to have more resources. I want it to be more focused. And so for me, it's not like a yes, but I don't need it any other time. It's an and, right? I want that, and I'm greedy. I want the long-term memory, and I want to be doing things on a daily basis to support my brain being as efficient and effective 10, 20 years from now as it is today. And we don't get there by all of a sudden having a problem and then addressing it. We get there by preventing
absolutely
that. And that often takes more nutrition than many of us are getting, even if we're eating good diets.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's, I just did another podcast where we talked about nutrition specifically related to brain health. And we're just not getting enough nutrients in our diet nowadays to really give our brain, which is under a lot of stress, more stress than humans have ever been built to handle evolutionarily. It just does not have the energy, the nutrients it needs to perform to the level it needs to. And so having these supplements helps to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's how I think about it. And, you and I have both started taking supplements long before we started working with patients. So, I'm, personally confident that supplements do a lot. Now, I wouldn't say, live whatever way you want and only take supplements and you'll get where you're going. That's, maybe a few people that would work for. But I know I perform better when I am attentive to my body's supplement needs.
Absolutely, yeah. So. And I think you hit on a key point there is that if you are eating fast food, ultra-processed food every single day for every meal, and then you're sleeping 4 hours after drinking 5 drinks a night, the supplements probably aren't going to save you or make a huge difference. But, once you've kind of cleaned up your lifestyle for the most part, the supplements are very well additive to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah. And what I would say, so my, 5.5 years active duty, a good chunk of that was in shipyards, overhaul, or out at sea after the ship came out.
Right.
And, especially out at sea, my first ship, I was in engineering. There was only 2 of us that could stand that particular engineering watch. It was called Engineering Officer of the Watch, EOW. But we were kind of the supervisor for the entire, propulsion plant. And since there was 2 of us, if the boilers were lit off, because this was a steam-driven ship back in the day, then one of us had to be always on watch. And there was 2 of us. So that meant 6 hours on, 6 hours off. You still had to do your job in the time you weren't actually on watch, which was probably another 6 hours. And then of the other 6 hours, like if you wanted to exercise, so sleep was always a scarce commodity. I was for sure crazy sleep deprived. Coming out of the Navy, body clock disruption, like 6 on, 6 off, of course, right?
Absolutely. Circadian rhythm is off completely.
Yeah. The food was not the best, right? It was, a calorie dense, not a nutrient dense food. Exercise was hard when you were out at sea. Stress could be, high. Yeah. I mean, I was at one point in the North Arabian Sea, and we knew we had someone else's missiles locked on us, and right, like lots of things, right? That all just stack. And so I think one of the reasons I came out of that in really good shape is because I took all these muscle head supplements.
Right.
That it turns out carnitine is really important for ATP, and some of the other things were important for the liver. And inadvertently, I was doing things to like maybe mitigate some of that stress.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
It wouldn't wipe it out all, but so supplements, even if we're far from a pristine lifestyle, may be the thing that's keeping us holding it all together. And an analogy I used in my book, but it goes back to the late 60s. A game we got one Christmas was, I think it was called Last Straw, but sometimes it's referred to as the camel game for people that want to look it up. But it was like picture a plastic camel with 2 buckets hanging over on either side, right?
I remember this game.
Yeah, and you would spin a wheel, and maybe you would get blue, and so you'd have to put a blue straw in your basket. The other team would spin, maybe they'd get green, they got to put it green. And at some point, one of the teams puts the last straw in the back, collapses, right? And the reason I bring that up is I think all of us carry around baskets full of straws, right? Maybe EMF, maybe toxins, like think of stress writ large, anything that might be
detrimental to your mitochondrial health and cellular health.
Yeah, and then all of us have a certain amount of ability to carry that burden.
Sure.
Just call that resilience. And we never can be sure how close we are to that last straw.
That's true.
We aren't. And what happens seemingly with patients is they'll be aware after, okay, this thing happened, and then my health collapsed, right? The back fell out. Maybe that's someone died or changing or exposure to, you name it. And, the way I think about it is, there was probably, if we had done a better job making you more resilient so you could carry more straws and finding some of the straws that we could lift out of the basket, that may not have been the last straw for you. In all likelihood, it probably wouldn't have been. And where I think supplements play a role is they can add into that resilience
some more
piece.
Resilience to you. Right. That's a great analogy, and it makes perfect sense when you say it that way. I always look at like an analogous situation, which is not the same as being in the Navy on active duty, but travel. Travel can be very tough to maintain any sort of routine, attend to your health. You're eating plain food sometimes, and I agree. I'm very cognizant of making sure I take my supplements with me when I'm traveling. And it's extremely, I notice the difference when I don't have my supplements when I travel. Sometimes I forget them and I have them. It's a completely different situation. The travel goes so much better. My circadian rhythm is so much better when I have my supplements with me.
Yeah, I think that's often where they shine, right? Where like in my normal life, reading research papers, writing reviews, doing other things in my role at Qualia, I'm used to what that day is like. It's when new demands come that's a new straw, right? That we need the extra support. So anyways, I think, I guess the main point was like, even if we're not doing the pristine things, diet, lifestyle, environment, then we may not feel the supplements as much, but they're still under the hood doing probably a lot of good.
Yeah. And so with the nootropic supplements, you mentioned piracetam, you mentioned creatine. What are the other key ingredients that really make a difference there?
Yeah, so we have creatine in another product, a cellular health product, but and creatine in capsules is just a lot of capsules, right?
You have to take it as a powder, right?
So it's just not well suited to Qualia Mind, but things that I'm, so lutein and xanthan in my, overrated, properly rated, underrated, crazy underrated for how good it is for the brain and as a long-term nootropic. It's not something you would feel in 5 days, but something that's for sure going to be making your brain a lot healthier over time. I'm a huge fan of saffron. Another thing that I think it gets a lot of acknowledgement for maybe mood things, but again, really good for areas around focus, memory. So, again, that's in Qualia Mind, but would be one of my, it's escape people how cool this herb and spice is for the brain. Yeah. And as a nootropic. I think it's always important to put some choline, like acetylcholine, like the building blocks for that, because when there's no RDA or daily value for choline, but when the Institute of Medicine has made their recommendation and Hanes or other big food things have looked at, turns out most of us are 100, 110 milligrams every day, less than what we should be getting. And some of that is because egg yolks rock for choline, and they were vilified for a long time. So I don't think you need to go crazy with the amount of choline in it, but the nootropic cholines like citicoline and alpha GPC, I think are an important base to cover it and make sure at least people's needs are being met, right? Because again, like without acetylcholine, like
10,000 hours wasted,
right? Yeah.
Right. You don't learn anything.
Yeah.
Because your neurons can't connect. The neuroplasticity doesn't occur.
Yeah. Right. And then, B vitamins, but it doesn't have to be mega dose, but all the B vitamins play collectively and individually important roles in the brain.
Absolutely.
ATP just as a start, right? Like, I think except for folic acid, every other B vitamin has a direct role in making energy. Magnesium, again, super important. And then there's a lot of herbs that I really like that, like, again, ginkgo, been around a long time. I would say properly rated, right? Like most people think, ginkgo is good for the brain. And I would agree, like it shows up routinely in studies. I always like to have an adaptogen in there because my analogy, like stress is always a big way I frame things, but stress is like kryptonite for the brain. So our brain just struggles to perform well when it's stressed. So I've been a big fan of rhodiola since like the late 90s. So I think of it as probably the best neuroadaptogen or nervous system. On some of the I remember reading studies on it in the late articles. At one point, Thorne sponsored a journal called Alternative Medicine Review. And I wrote probably 30 plus articles for it over the years. And I was one of maybe the first review article on PubMed on rhodiola I did for that journal in maybe 2003. So there's only a couple of human studies. But at the time, it really struck me, this is much less an adrenal adaptogen and much more an autonomic nervous system adaptogen. So it's, to me, it's one of the best nootropic adaptogens. So big fan of rhodiola.
Got it.
As well. Lion's mane for the neuroplasticity. So there's just a lot of good ingredients that end up as solid 4 and 5s when, all the research is done. And, I want to take many of these things, but more importantly, I want the whole formula to perform as I hope. And so we recently, Qualia Mind has been out since 2018.
That was the first product, right?
Yeah, that was our first product. And I think beginning of September this year, we did what we've internally said Qualia Mind 2.0. And what the goal was, okay, old Qualia Mind was 7 capsules. Let's get it down to 6. Still a lot of capsules, but we're talking, a lot of nutrition for the brain. Can we get it to work better? And again, my big 3 are like quickly within 5 days. Motivation, energy, focus. People have to feel that, right? They have to get that buy-in to get the long-term things, at least nootropic users.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted it to, do better for those things. I wanted to, put the underappreciated, the luteins and, saffrons and things like that that weren't in the original formula. So the new Mind, the one here on the counter is, went through that process. We tested a bunch of different recipes head-to-head against old Qualia Mind, and this one won. So, I was excited to start taking it.
Yeah. And when you say you tested it head-to-head, are you doing actual neurocognitive studies? How are you testing it?
For this, so what we'll sometimes do is tapping, which is for, fatigue, reaction times. But what we often do would be more subjective studies. So we'll ask directly about, there's validated questionnaires that are used for things like cognition and focus and memory. So we'll look at those and then see how people perform. And there's always a big placebo response. And in this case, what we're looking for is one that clearly separates from the rest, if you like. And we have a long history with original Qualia, so we really wanted to, we wouldn't have launched if we didn't feel like this one performed better. Yeah. So I think the story that I told marketing was like, better results, fewer capsules, something along those lines, because it seemed ambitious to do everything that we set out to do, and at the end it worked. But the nice thing about Qualia is, had it not, I wouldn't have been pressured to just push something out. So I would have been like, okay, like back to the drawing board. Let's see if we can make it better.
Do something different, right? Got it. And then, shifting from brain health to gut health. Let's talk about gut health. The microbiome, the trillions of bacteria and fungi that live synergistically with us in our body. They need prebiotics, probiotics, even postbiotics. And, those come in different forms. And I know that you've put together a product that kind of helps in all of those aspects. Yeah.
So if I could only spend the rest of my career studying one thing, it would be the gut microbiome. I think it's we're just going to learn so much more there. And most people have heard of the gut-brain axis, and so it ties in with the brain. And the gut-brain axis, in terms of how we show up, it's more mood and stress that is what scientists typically focus on when they're talking about the brain end of the gut-brain axis, which is what I looked at when we created it. It's Qualia Symbiotic is the product. But and one of the things at the end of the day is I'm often want to communicate to our marketing people, and like sometimes they're kids, right? About a product. And so for the Qualia Symbiotic, the way I think about the gut microbiome, it's an ecosystem, right? Very complicated ecosystem with, like maybe 5,000 different species that I have, that you have. Ours aren't going to be the same.
Sure.
Making 100,000 metabolites with 2/3 or more of our immune system located in the gut.
It's incredibly complex.
Making many of the same neurotransmitters our brain makes. Our enteric nervous system, our second brain is there, right? So you could never figure it all out.
Isn't 90% of the serotonin in our body made in the gut?
Yeah, and like 50% of the dopamine.
50% of the dopamine as well is made in the gut.
Yeah, a fair amount of the melatonin.
And does this serotonin and dopamine cross the blood-brain barrier?
So this would be more believed by scientists than established fact, but it's more believed, like these are ancient communication molecules that our brains just repurposed those communications. So they use them to communicate themselves, they being the gut microorganisms, and with our nerve cells and other things lining it. And so they're mostly used locally.
Interesting.
Like dopamine would be a big molecule to get into the brain.
Right,
as an example.
Right. So it's not that these molecules are going from the gut to the brain to affect the brain. It's just communicating in the gut, and then that translates into, you talk about the gut-brain axis, right? Yeah. There's nerve signals going from the gut to the brain that are also communicating as well.
Correct. So the vagal nerve would be the main
nerve,
pathway, which is our parasympathetic nervous system. And about 90% of the traffic is going from the gut to the brain and only 10% going the other way.
Oh my gosh.
So there's a huge flow of information to the brain because, digesting food and making sure like, oh, we ate this thing and now there's this bad bacteria, like all that has to be communicated to the brain so it can take the right. I think Lisa Feldman Barrett would say like, manage our body budgets effectively, right?
Exactly.
So, and one of the things, qualia, we think of ourselves as a complex system science first. So like there's reductionist science, there's these mechanisms. You kind of work up from like a mechanism and then assume if you've figured all that stuff out, the whole system's going to behave the way you want it to. Complexity science would say, no, like sometimes there's emergent behaviors, these other things that occur on the level of the whole that weren't anticipated based on the mechanisms, right? Things adapt and learn, right? And, so because the gut's so complicated, you could spend, I'm sure, many lifetimes and you'd just be kidding yourself to think you got it all figured out.
Exactly.
And you don't have to. Like thinking in terms of an ecosystem, and one of my favorite YouTube videos from years ago was when they introduced wolves back, I think it was to Yellowstone National Park, and then did like a time-lapse thing. And over the course of a couple of years, the flows of rivers changed because the wolves chased off the deer that were overfeeding, grass and other things grew back, and then the land was more solid, so the river, wolves in that ecosystem would be thought of as a keystone species.
Got it.
And all ecosystems have one or more keystone species, usually more. Elephants would be an example in part of the African landscape. And so we used to think lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, like these, well-established probiotics were the only important things in our gut microbiome because they're the only things that can survive typically in stools when exposed to oxygen. So it's that like I lost my keys, and the only place the light's shining is here, so I'm only going to look here where the keys are over here, right? So with the advances in the Human Genome Project that led to being able to sequence the gut microbiome, now we know those aren't particularly even important after infancy as organisms, where Akkermansia, as an example, I'm sure many listeners will have heard of Akkermansia, would be the keystone species in the mucin lining in our gut. And so the nice thing in ecosystems, if you can do a good job either reintroducing or making sure the keystone species are doing well, like they're getting enough food, they should reshape the whole environment.
Got it.
Right? So, we would, know of things like prebiotics and, FOS, inulin, those are really great foods for bifidobacteria, particularly, which is, that's still important, right? We have, many species of that inhabit, but, they're not as important as a Faecalibacterium prausnii or Akkermansia. So, my goal when I was creating it is, okay, how do we provide it so that these more important keystone species thrive?
Got it.
In Greg's gut, because if they do, then they'll handle figuring out a whole bunch of stuff. Right?
I see. So that's such a great example of the wolves in Yellowstone and how it changed the entire environment. And so what you're saying is there are certain species of bacteria that can positively affect the environment of our gut that we need to be really focused on. And Bifidobacterium, Lactobacillus are probably not them. Those are other species that are important that need to be there, but there's other ones that affect everything. And Akkermansia is one.
Yeah.
What are some of the others?
Well, Faecobacterium proutzii. I may not be pronouncing it scientifically correct, but that F. proutzii would be another one. I think of as one of the most important keystone species. Roseburia would be another. Like they're all ones that aren't probiotics, other than Akkermansia newly has become available. But these, you'll see even in research them referred to as keystone species, sometimes as next generation organisms. Meaning that eventually it's anticipated there'd be the next wave, like probiotics 2.0.
Right. Interesting. And so, when we do some gut testing at our clinic, and our gut tests, I would say, fall into three different categories. One is harmful species that are in the gut, so things that are pathogens. Secondly is the diversity of the microbiome as well. And lastly, we're looking for signs of stress in the gut, things like leaky gut, for example, right? And so when we're testing for all of these things, I think there's always a little bit of confusion on how does a practitioner take that information and make it clinically relevant to the patient, right? And so can you talk a little bit about that, like diversity, pathogens, et cetera, and how you turn that into actually like doing something?
Yeah. So diversity is super important. And when they've done studies of more, think of hunter-gatherer, they have way more diversity than we do. And we, seemingly have less than a generation ago, right? And once people, I think, mistakenly assume, okay, I take a probiotic and it takes up residence. And the story I told our head of marketing, because she takes her daughters to the San Diego Zoo. They love that. And I'm like, okay, so most people assume taking a probiotic is like putting more animals in the zoo. That's not what happens. Right? Those cages are filled. What a probiotic is like having more visitors come through the zoo, or maybe more people that work at the zoo. Right? They're passing through. They're not colonizing.
Got it.
But they shape the environment in positive ways. Right? Is how I would think about them. Right? So they're important. If we're adding, say, more, people going to the San Diego Zoo, then we probably want to have more food for them, right? So that's prebiotics, right? Like prebiotics, and every ecosystem typically will perform better if more energy is put into the ecosystem. Energy, in our world is sunlight. Yeah. In the oceans, it's slightly different as you get really deep. But in our gut microbiome, energy is largely prebiotics. Things like those organisms can metabolize into energy. Polyphenols would be another thing. There's certain types of bacteria that thrive on polyphenols.
Polyphenols are mostly found in fruits and vegetables.
Yeah. They're your quercetins and the ficetins and the things in like the resveratrol that you brought up earlier. They're things that give a lot of the color. They're plant defense compounds fundamentally. But there's certain organisms that thrive on that, and Akkermansia is one. Akkermansia does its main food supply is something called mucin, which we secrete, but polyphenols seem to do something to fortify it. So like in a cell culture, you would get more abundance of Akkermansia if you gave it mucins with, say, like
polyphenols. Right. Yeah.
So that's like food supply we want covered. We want something that shapes the ecosystem. Ideally, we're doing things with the prebiotics that preferentially feed some of the keystone species, right? And resistant starch would be one of those things, right? So again, I would put that in my underrated, underappreciated, crazy important. We would have evolutionarily had a lot more resistant starch in our diet. And then most ecosystems have what's thought of as abiota, like dead and decaying things, right? That's where your California condors and other, like without that biomass and the things that subsist on them, you can't have a healthy ecosystem. So all ecosystems typically have abiota, the dead and decaying. And I believe that's the postbiotics. Got it. Like, the probiotic organisms that have been inactivated. that I think our gut performs better with them. And we'd have likely had a lot of those in our food supply. Like bacteria would have been exposed to the food and just, died off, but we would have still eaten it before our food supply was so clean, so to speak. And this is Greg's story, so it may not be true, but the immune cells that reside all along our gut, and I said it's 2/3 or so, it's a lot of our immune system. It's what they are doing is they're almost reaching out between cell linings to sample what's going through and then learn from it and say like, okay, things look good. I don't need to do anything. Or like, oh my goodness, this like bad thing is there. Like alarms go off, right? So it's always like reaching out and grabbing. And the live bacteria, like probiotics, it's going to try to learn from, but they're going to be kicking and screaming like they've got their own agenda. Where a postbiotic, an inactivated one, or the debris from that is going to be super easy to learn from. Because the immune system learns from molecular patterns. It doesn't need that pattern to be alive. Right? So I think of postbiotics as a really important part of a symbiotic because they're very friendly to the immune system, and we want to be good friends with the immune system. And then, digestive enzymes, you would know, like, and the way I think of that is if you had like an ecosystem like Yellowstone, there's other ecosystems upstream that are flowing into it. And we want, if they're, not doing well, then Yellowstone's going to struggle. Right. And in our gut, the way that's designed, the upper GI is what then, if it's doing its job, then things get to the gut microbiome in a way that's more manageable. And so digestive enzymes would be, part of then supporting that upstream. So, when I, was creating Koya Symbiotic, those are all things like, all right, do we have support for this ecosystem and this one? Do, upper GI and lower GI? Are we feeding the keystone bacteria? Are we providing some probiotics that are going to be ones that ideally would have a gut-brain effect in clinical studies? So what I would term a psychobiotic, one that very few probiotics have been shown to date. Almost all probiotics are going to have a benefit of some sort in the gut, but very few have had with, say, mood or stress. So, I was like, all right, we're going to find one that does and make sure we include that. And lactospore is that particular one. Its study was one of the better studies I've seen. Okay. Period for probiotics, but it was, people with substantial GI issues and substantial mood issues, and progressively each month, both improved. So
this symbiotic has digestive enzymes, prebiotics, postbiotics, and also probiotics, pre, post, and pros. Any other ingredients in it?
Yeah, then it has...
do you have polyphenols in there too?
Yeah, so we've got 10 fermented berries.
Oh, great.
We've got it's a kombucha made from tea leaves from a mountain range in Taiwan that's also been fermented. We've got fermented turmeric. So I think one of the mistakes made with symbiotics is you'll often see, maybe it's good, like this probiotic in it really works. Maybe inulin, that's the most common thing, or FOS in it, which can work. But like the way I would describe it, like San Diego Zoo, there's a lot of different animals there living there in the cages. Why would we think like bamboo is going to be the ideal food for all of them? Right. Let's give a diversity of different types of fibers. Because what you would normally see in a study that measured it, if only FOS was added in pretty high amounts to the diet, 10 grams or more, which would be common in a prebiotic study, diversity decreases. Because you're now like overfeeding one group and they're going to outcompete others. So the goal is a diversity. So, part of the reason for the 10 fermented berries, the fermented turmeric, the fermented tea, the blend of different fibers like 2 resistant starches, sun fiber, is to make sure that we're giving a diverse food supply.
Yeah.
So that would be how I approach it. And then there's a few accessory things like that you would know about, like N-acetylglucosamine.
Sure.
That's just really important for that gut barrier role. So
there's also ingredients that help the actual physical gut barrier too. Yeah. So it's kind of like an all-in-one kind of product for everything gut health.
Correct.
I like that. Okay.
Yeah. And we, when we did our pilot study on it, I used a GI health questionnaire, but then a questionnaire called DAS-21, which stands for Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale.
Okay.
21 because there's 21 questions. And we wouldn't have recruited people with, like major depression or anxiety, but many of us have low levels of these things. And what we saw was super cool. We expected to see a big improvement in the GI symptoms, and we asked the other questionnaire more as a fishing expedition. Like, the hope is we're affecting the brain through the gut-brain axis, but let's see. And we saw like 60% decrease in self-rated stress over a couple of weeks.
Well, that's incredible.
And one of the cool things about that DAS-21 questionnaire is for different scores, it will group someone into a category, like normal stress, mild stress, moderate, severe. Almost every single person, so maybe if in our study, my numbers are going to be wrong because it's been a while since I looked at it, but maybe in our initial baseline, 8 people had normal stress, and then, the other 27-ish, one of the other categories.
Yeah.
Everyone migrated to better categories. And by the end of the study, something like 27 of them were normal stress.
For 2 weeks of the fix, that just shows you the power of the gut-brain axis.
Yeah, and so people, again, just aren't aware of how strongly the microbiome, the vagus nerve, impact our ability to be resilient and have good moods.
Is a DAS-21 questionnaire something that, say, I want to get on this supplement, and can I go online and take the DAS-21 questionnaire?
Yeah, you can find it.
I'm sure you can find it.
It's an open source questionnaire, so there's no license required to use it.
Right. I'm a big fan of N of 1 experiments, and so I feel it's always good, if you can do a free online test, put an intervention in place, and do the test again later. Yeah. It can really kind of either solidify that behavior further for you, or it can make you think that maybe this is something I don't need. At least you know. But I think it's always good to do those and have like little controlled experiments that you do throughout your life. And so I try to do that with all new supplements, any new kind of habit I put into place, do little N of 1 experiments.
I think it's important. There's an acronym, your mileage may vary, that's been widely used in the nootropic community. YMMV.
Yeah.
But your
mileage may vary.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen that on a lot of the blogs on nootropics.
And that's what it means. Like, because, this thing rocked for Greg doesn't mean it's going to for you, right? Like we're all unique, and our needs are going to be different. And the way we think of it at Qualia is for almost anything, there's going to be a subset of people that are super responders. So it's their jam. It just really works well for them. Then a subset that are good responders. So it's what you would expect happen. And then a subset of no response, like it just wasn't.
Right.
And then a subset maybe of negative response, right?
It's a bell-shaped curve again.
Right. And so we expect that with any of the things that we're putting together and testing. And our goal is really to shift the bell curve. So normally you'd see very few super responders and a whole bunch of good and no effect. And our goal is we want to get to a point with a product where the amount of people that are having really, what I would think excellent responses is about competing with the amount that were good responses. And then ideally have, virtually no negative responses. Yeah. And then, what ends up is, somewhere 80 to, 85, 90% are in that good and excellent category, usually when we move a product forward. And then there's, 10 to 15%, it didn't do anything that we could pick up on that particular study. And it's one of the reasons we have the 100-day money-back guarantee. We want people to try our products, and if it doesn't do what you hoped it would do, then, it's at least risk-free in that. Yeah. The financial sense, because I'm not delusional, at least in that area. And, I am aware from being in practice and my long time in the industry that relatively few things are going to, across the board, work for everyone. And those are going to be things like someone's deficient in vitamin C and took vitamin C.
Yeah. So interesting. I like how you put that, because I think supplements sometimes get a bad name because someone takes it for a little while and they don't feel an effect. And I think there's 2 or 3 sides to that. One is they're not really testing anything to know. They just kind of have a subjective gestalt about it, right? But secondly, also, you're right. Some things do have an effect and some things have no effect. And I think what you guys do that's really powerful too is seeing how different combinations of things work together. I think, there's a little bit of supplement overwhelm from people taking multiple things separately and having 50 bottles on the shelf versus I like how you combine in the Symbiotic product different things that can benefit your gut completely. And probably a lot of them work synergistically as well, right?
Yeah. I think, like I said, it like probiotics on their own will do something beneficial.
Yeah.
And it makes more sense if I'm adding more organisms in to add more energy. So why not do like good prebiotics with that?
Right.
I'm a huge fan of fermented foods. Like, again, most of us would have had way more in our ancient ancestry than we get today, just because fermentation's, an old process. And, so fermented foods, postbiotics, like all these things are important. And, when I think of Qualia Symbiotic, we really created that. We wanted it to be a scoopable, good tasting, like all in one, thing for your gut health that, I always think of properly nerdy at Qualia, right? That we want to take, right?
That you want to take, right? Exactly.
And give to people we care about.
And so this is how many scoops of this? How many grams are you putting in?
1 scoop's about 10 grams.
Okay, and you just put in water.
Yeah, it's
once or twice a day, or
we once a day.
Once a day.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And is there any specific recommendation on when to take it and take it with food or not?
No, it doesn't. So there's a couple, like colonization would be one probiotic myth. Another would be like almost timing, right? Like, I need to take it away, from when stomach acid will be high, right? So you often hear people like, like
that's a myth.
Yeah, well, when stomach acid the highest, based on like what you know?
I mean, when you're eating, or right after you eat, right when you put some food in your mouth is when I would say your G cells start secreting acid. Am I wrong?
It will go up then, for sure. And contextually, right, depending what you eat. And it starts,
right.
Like we learn, right? And our system will, like if it knows a steak's coming, as soon as it tastes a steak, it will be getting more ready to digest it. But it's actually, if someone has a healthy body clock, it's between, say, 10 and midnight.
So it's actually circadian controlled then?
Very strongly.
Really?
Yeah,
interesting.
That's the highest amount of acid
10
produced.
to midnight.
Like in general, right? It'll vary. But yeah, those studies go back to the 70s.
Interesting.
And so you sometimes see like, if you Google it, like, take your probiotic, like, after dinner before bed because stomach acid's the lowest. It's like, no.
That's when it's the highest.
Right. Yeah. Like if that's your thing. And, I often, like sometimes we just overcomplicate things. Like, I've looked at in studies, okay, when did they time the probiotic? Often they don't mention it, right? No. They'll just tell people, like, take it twice a day or 3 times a day or take it, at breakfast or once a day. But that lactospore study, that really great gut-brain one, they had people do it 30 minutes before breakfast, right? And, that makes sense, right? Give it a head start, getting through before that, meal-induced surge. But spores are like, spore-form probiotics are like a seed that's protected. So most live probiotics struggle to make it past both stomach acid and bile acids.
Interesting.
It's why, like you'll see, like a bifidobacterium bifida study, maybe they gave 10 billion CFU, but they're giving that massive amount because they know very few of them are going to survive those 2 areas of the upper GI. Where spore forms, since they're protected, they actually mostly get through and then bloom when they hit the right environment, pH, moisture, other things, right? So like a spore, like the lactospore, it's Bacillus coagulans, but a very specific strain is, in studies you'll see it dosed more like 2 billion CFU. And that's why like 2 billion, way more of that 2 billion is going to get to the microbiome than of a 10 to 20 billion like non-spore form. And so that's
Interesting. So does that apply to like your probiotic yogurts, for example? Like you're taking these and they're supposed to be live culture bacteria. They're not in spore form. Are they?
Yeah, they'll be a little protected. But again, it used to be, we're taking these because they're going to populate our gut.
Yeah.
They're not.
But it's not really.
And even if
that.
many of them die, now they're going to be postbiotic-y, like the debris, right? They'll do something.
They'll do something, right?
Yeah, they're not going to be as good at reshaping the environment as,
So the probiotics in your product, there's some spore form.
We only use spore because one of the things, and I talk with quite a few experts that work for vendors, like my suppliers that supply probiotics. All of them said, these complicated products that live bacteria in with, say, greens or resistant starches or prebiotics, that's a really tough place for them to survive long term, even with refrigeration, where spores are just resilient, like they're dormant until they germinate, right? So they're just it's presuming they do what they're supposed to do, right? Like they have the right clinical outcome, then it's a better way, I think, of putting probiotic organisms in something like a blend of things like what we have in Kawhi Symbiotic.
Wow. So, I mean, you're learning a lot here. So these keystone bacteria are more important, and getting them in spore form is the most effective way of getting them as well.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I wouldn't maybe say the most effective, but most effective in our delivery format.
In your delivery format, right, exactly.
If you're doing, it's in the health food store, refrigerated, and you're going to keep it in your refrigerator, because what happens with probiotics is they're usually grown on something, right? That's their ecosystem, their food supply. And then to be put in, these are the live ones, not the spores, they would be centrifuged off or other things, right? They're separated from that, growth matrix and isolated. And at that point, the way I would describe them, they're stressed, right? Yeah. They're not in their home anymore. They're starved for food. They're going to be really fragile. Right. So unless they're meticulously taken care of. Now, in yogurt, they're not going to be as stressed, right? Because their home's there, their food supply is there. Yeah. It's going to be different.
And so that's why some of these probiotics that you see need to be refrigerated, is because otherwise they're just not going to survive.
Yeah, like
being in the bottle for a long time.
Think of like in the longevity community cryogenics, right? Yeah, like exactly. Kind of suspended animation till circumstances are better.
Right. Wow, that's a lot of great information on probiotics and just gut health in general. And I really like the ability of combining different products into one product, and just like once again, you get supplement fatigue after a while. You don't know what to take, and that's a really good way of managing supplement fatigue, I think, too.
Yeah, it's so much. I mean, I'm comfortable taking a lot of capsules, and it's nice to take something that I just put in water that tastes pleasant and covers so many bases.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about longevity supplements. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk there, and a lot of talks around one aspect of longevity, which is senescent cells. And so I'd love to get your explanation, because I love your analogy, I love your explanations on what are senescent cells, why they're important, and how do they affect our cellular health and our longevity.
All right. Well, I'll start off with another analogy.
Okay,
again,
great.
like I always have to do something to our head of marketing, and she's an avid gardener.
Okay.
So I was thinking, all right, and so senescent cells, we'll kind of step back before I get the analogy. Senescent cells, sometimes people refer them as zombie cells, but cellular senescence has been known about for a long time, many decades. And it was, and what cellular senescence means is a normal healthy cell will be born, live its life, and go through what's called apoptosis, cellular death. Ideally, right? Necrosis, there's other things that might prematurely cause it to end its life. And apoptosis is a really organized, cellular process that at the end of the day, the cell just breaks apart into pieces, and the immune system comes in, eats those up, and then recycles the parts to make new cells. And so, that's, what happens with cells. And, if you Googled it, you'll probably see, like, on average, our cells live 7 years. Something like that.
And different cells live a different amount of time.
Yeah, crazy variable. So that average completely skews reality. Like neurons are irreplaceable. Right. Like we don't want neurons to die. Right. Our heart cells, I think, get turnover about every 4 decades. So they're not easily replaced. The cells that line the gut lining, crazy fast turnover.
Every few days, right? Skin cells.
Yeah, like 60 days. Like some,
60 days for gut cells.
I think the gut lining cells is about 60. Liver, it's like 1 to 3 years. Closer to 3 when we're really young, closer to 1.5 as we get older. But anyways, there's just, fat cells I think are like 15 years, muscles like that. Anyways, each thing has its own like life history. But apoptosis is a key term. And what makes a cell senescent is that for some reason, and we'll just again use the idea of stress, it's had enough stress that it's been, the program that's been enacted isn't apoptosis. It's been don't replicate no matter what, like don't make new cells. But it's not like a characteristic of a vibrant, healthy cell is it can clone itself, right? Make like offspring cells. And that happens. Like that's how we stay populated in our tissues with cells. And so the characteristic, a characteristic is that in an aging context is senescent cells resist going through that apoptosis. So they've just figured out on a cellular level how not to go through that.
How not to die.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And
not to fully die.
Not fully die.
Right.
Yep. And then another characteristic is they secrete what are called SASP factors, SASP. And that stands for senescence-associated secretory phenotype.
Right.
And these are your inflammatory cytokines and all kinds of.
So why do they secrete those?
So,
because these are impact the organism negatively, right? So these cells are not dying off; they're staying alive somehow. They figured out how to do that, but they're secreting toxic metabolites and cytokines to their surrounding cells.
Yeah, and so stepping back, the way I think of it is cellular senescence is a category. And this oversimplifies it, but you can think of there's transient senescent cells and lingering senescent cells.
Okay.
And so like during fetal development, there'll be a wave or different waves of cellular senescence that come in that are important for embryological development.
Right.
And they're all transient. That wave will come and recede. The senescent cells will appear and then all, go through apoptosis. They'll, go through their end of cycle and the immune system will find the stragglers. So transient senescence is a thing, and it serves a really important role. So, if like young Greg in the Navy, that would have said like, oh, I just drank last night. I'm going to go like penalty exercise today and like really stress my body. I probably caused some muscle damage. Young person, part of that response is we make transient senescent cells that they're involved in calling in the immune system to help repair, regenerate, right? But like,
got it.
Right. And so those SAS factors are in part like help, immune system, come here.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
And so when sometimes you'll run across things, well, don't senescent cells do good things? And the answer is absolutely yes. The transient ones, right? And when you talk about longevity, we're not talking about those. We're talking about these lingering ones that are resisting going through apoptosis.
Makes sense.
And so those same things that would be beneficial in that context of like really quick message, get the immune system in, help, become problematic when it's constant, right? And so that the same molecules contextually just do something different when they would be like acute versus chronic is the way I would think about it.
Makes sense.
So
if we were to get rid of some of these resistant senescent cells, it would actually promote health. So so again, like it's senescent cells really go back to Hayflick's work in 1961, what's now the Hayflick limit. And before that, it was widely thought that a cell, at least in a cell culture, would live forever as long as the environment was right. And what he found was no, like a cell can divide about 50 times.
50 times max, and then it runs out of that for some reason. Maybe another, I think it was in the 70s, they figured out, okay, this was because of something now they discovered called telomeres, which now we know widely about. Telomere attrition would be a big part of, it's one of the hallmarks of aging.
Right.
And so that would be thought of as telomere-induced cellular senescence, right? They're becoming senescent because it's a DNA damage, like a damage control response. Like telomeres get so short, we don't want that cell to replicate. Let's enact the senescence program so it doesn't. And then, somewhere because of that, it's always been thought, okay, like this must have something to do with longevity, right? So that's why they gave it the word senescence, right? Senile would be the same root. But then it wasn't, I think it was, she's passed away, what's her name? She was a Buck Institute famous researcher. In the early 2000s, she discovered SAS factors, right?
Okay.
And like,
it's not Elizabeth Blackburn?
It's not Elizabeth
She
Blackburn.
discovered
It's
telomeres.
It might come to me. I can picture,
That's
but
okay. Yeah.
anyways.
Yeah.
So then it's like, oh, like maybe these are even more important because they're secreting all these things into the microenvironment. And then I think it was around 2009, they did a transgene experiment where genetic modification wouldn't be quite the right name. They really reprogram genes in a transgene experiment. But what they did is they, made these animals, I think they were mice, so that they would eliminate senescent cells as they got older and older, and found that, like, wow, we didn't anticipate what a big impact this had. They were healthier, they lived longer, leaner, healthier for the whole 9 years.
Sure.
And so I think that really kickstarted the field, realizing like, oh, we always thought these were important, but they might be ridiculously important.
Right.
And then 2015, Mayo researchers, Scripps Institute of Aging researchers, published a paper that coined the term senolytic. And what they did at that point is like, okay, we know they're resisting, these lingering ones are resisting apoptosis. Let's scan like our, database of things that because of other research, we know helps correct some of those mechanisms. And then, take some of those compounds that, show up as promising, put them in cell cultures with senescent cells and see if they cause the senescent cells to finally disintegrate. And then, they identified two, quercetin, a dietary supplement being one, and dasatinib, an immunomodulator, a medication being the other.
That's a prescription medication.
Yeah. Then let's now give these to live animals and see, does that make a difference in what I would call health span as a buzzy word, but like healthy aging as opposed to necessarily living longer. And what they found is, yes, and even better when they combine the two together. So D and Q is that stack, dasatinib and quercetin. And there's, I would guess by a lot, if you were to look at senolytic studies on PubMed, many will use that D and Q stack.
Right. Can we go a little bit deeper into the mechanism of action of how D and Q works? Because they work differently, right?
Yeah. So, so nothing usually does one thing. The more you look, the more you find other things. But quercetin works on a specific nutrient sensing pathway.
Okay.
And mTOR would be a nutrient sensing pathway for proteins. I want to say it's the PI3K or PI. It's a different one, and that feeds into what would be like the pro and anti-apoptotic proteins that we have in cells. Sure. And what that means, again, this way oversimplifies it for smart people listening, but for everyone else, this is at least will get you in the right way of thinking about it. Where cells will constantly be making some proteins that are voting for hang around, like I'm anti or I'm pro or I'm sorry, I'm anti-apoptotic, like stay around, linger. Another group that are like, no, time to go, right? So pro apoptotic. So those proteins are always being made. There's some amount probably of each in all our cells. And what happens in a senescent cell, because of these different pathways, and they're called SCAP networks, senescent cell anti-apoptotic pathways, is that at some point they skew the vote. So it's in favor of we're not going away, we're hanging around.
Got it.
And so that was what the Mayo and Scripps researchers tried to do. Are there compounds that affect these different SCAP networks in ways that might shift the vote just enough that it finally goes in favor of proceeding through apoptosis?
Interesting.
And so some have different mechanisms, like piperlongamine, which is an alkaloid from long pepper, an Ayurvedic plant works differently than fisetin. Fisetin, quercetin overlap a bit on their pathways. Dasatinib would work in a very different, it's a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, but even more specifically, a SRC kinase inhibitor, which is probably beyond even smart people listening to this. But they all have complementary things. They're kind of approaching the problem from a different angle.
Got it.
But at the end of the day, the goal is to shift the vote just enough. And one of the reasons you don't have to do senolytics every day is because you just have to get the vote for that particular cell to shift once so that it goes through this.
I see. So
you don't have
whatever
to
cells are in that mode right now, that senolytic mode, you give the D and Q, and then those all kind of shift the vote.
Maybe not all, but some will, right? Like the ones close enough. Got
it.
And the goal with cellular senescence isn't maybe to get rid of all. Like it's, make sure we're below a threshold where they're contributing to issues, right?
I see.
So because of that, from the get-go, those researchers approached it with what sometimes they'll call hit-and-run dosing, but an intermittent, like give this for a couple of days and then we don't need to give it away. And again, and they thought of that as a good risk-reward approach because dasatinib, the D part, can have some pretty serious negative effects if you're doing it all the time. So that was kind of baked in to the approach to senescent cells is, we don't need to do something every day because we're just trying to get the vote to change for that cell once. And then for the next group, we'll just do another.
Do it later. And that's why there's all the protocols of intermittent dosing of senolytics where you're not taking it every day. And that's the reasoning behind that. You don't have to do it all the time, right?
Yeah. And so then getting back to the analogy, so I mentioned that our head of marketing is an avid gardener. So I was trying to explain how this is. And apoptosis comes from a Greek word that means falling off in the context of, a fruit or leaf falling off a plant, right?
Got it.
So it's this might work for, right? So I'm like, okay, think of senescent cells in your tissues as your daughters are young. You were like a younger version of you. You go out in your garden, every single plant, like crazy green, like all the leaves, super healthy, vibrant, like rock. This is great. And now, we're getting a little older. You go out one day and it's like, oh, this plant has some yellow leaves on it. And okay, well, maybe they'll fall off, right? They should fall off. But, you go out a couple days later and it's not only have they not fallen off, but there's more yellow leaves on the plant. It's like, oh my God, what should I do? Because what happens on a plant is yellow leaves, one, they use resources that can't go to the healthy green leaves, so our healthy cells. Two, they attract pests like mites and other things, right? That then can spread to healthy leaves and turn them into yellowing leaves. So, what a good gardener will do will periodically prune away those yellowing leaves to help the plant out. And that allows resources to be used where they should be.
Makes sense.
There's opportunity for new growth. So senescent cells are very much, in an aging sense, like those yellow leaves. They should have gone through, they should have fallen off the plant. They didn't. And sometimes they're called zombie cells, and that's two-part, right? One is they haven't gone through cellular death, but they're not able to make new cells. So they're somewhere between live healthy cells and cellular death. But the other reason is those SASP factors, right? Secreting things into the microenvironment stresses out healthy cells and can turn them into new senescent cells, just like yellow leaves on a plant can beget more yellow leaves.
Right.
So the way that I think of senolytics is we're just acting like the gardener that's coming in periodically pruning things away.
Got it.
So
great analogy. I love that. And so you guys have a product for that, the senolytic. And what is in this and what is the protocol for taking it?
Yeah, so we'll start first. So one of I think the most important recognitions that came out of that original D&Q study was that, one, they had different mechanisms, but two, as an example, they found quercetin was senolytic in endothelial cells, as an example.
Okay.
But in that study, it wasn't in adipose tissue and fat cells.
Okay.
Dasatinib wasn't so useful in endothelial cells, but was really useful in adipose cells.
Okay.
So something can be senolytic, but that doesn't mean it's going to be equally in all tissues. In fact, it's unlikely that would be the case.
Really? Interesting.
And the reason is, again, like think of cellular senescent or senescent cells as a category. And at one point it was thought telomeres were the main reason, right? Like telomere attrition. But that's probably like a very small part of why many of the senescent cells in my body or yours would have become senescent.
Got it.
And what researchers would call it is premature stress-induced senescence. So all kinds of things that can cause cellular stress, independent of telomere length, can cause a cell to become senescent. Sure. Because, and this goes back to my Navy way of thinking about things. So on a ship, there was always a damage control division, and their job was, put out fires, fix leaks, like any damage. They're the ones that are their job, their specialty is in fixing damage. And our cells are going to be stressed all the time, just like you and I get stressed. And the way I think about it is they can go through a couple different doors when they're stressed. Door number one, and the ideal one, is the amount of stress they can handle. They've got enough resilience, resources. It's hormetic. They toughen up, right? Mm-hmm. They maybe make more antioxidant defenses, glutathione, whatever, that whole suite of things. They're good. Door number two is like, okay, stress was more than that, and they took on some damage. And then think, like the cellular equivalent of the Navy's damage control division would be processes like autophagy or DNA repair, right? Mm-hmm. They're intended to repair the damage. So again, like more stress, maybe a different type of stress to some cells that were less resilient, and that they were damaged, it got repaired, we're good. But now a cell's like, okay, maybe the stress is even higher, or the cell was less resilient, and it will become unrepairable. Right. And so that's what a senescent cell is, right? It's unrepairable. Right. And so, part of the, I'm not really sure where we started before I got on this tangent.
So, I mean, just thinking about you were going through the gardening analogy and why, and what are the products in here and how do they work? Yeah.
So one of the things that's really cool about a lot of the plant polyphenols and like the piperlongamines and alkaloids is that they're good at supporting things like autophagy and good at finally getting cells to go through like the apoptosis process. So it's one of the reasons that I like working with things that are maybe less targeted, right? Like a pharmaceutical compound.
Right.
But I think where I was going is the type of stress can, so if say like ionizing radiation or UV or nutrient stress or mitochondrial dysfunction, the type of stress in a tissue may cause a lineage of senescent cells that would be better targeted by maybe ficitin than quercetin, or better targeted by piperlongamine or curcumin, or like a senescent cell is a category, and the stress induced would be the largest type. And the tissue they're in, what caused them to become senescent, could make them so certain senolytic compounds are less good and others are more useful. So when we were creating Qualia Senolytic, I wanted to make sure we gave a portfolio of things that were senolytic to give a better possibility of having multiple tissues benefit, senescent cells created by lots of different types of stresses benefit, right?
Makes total sense.
So that's where I was going with that. And I think
that's why you need multiple compounds again to work together, because senescent cells, they become senescent for many different reasons, you're saying, and different compounds target the different reasons that a cell became senescent.
Yeah, or at least different tissues.
And different tissues.
With that original study, quercetin, wasn't useful in some tissues, but was really useful in others. And the ficitin, the same group of researchers eventually were the ones that identified ficitin as being senolytic. And they actually reported it as more potent than quercetin on just a heads-up basis. But that did work in fat cells, right? So there'd be even though they would have some of this shared mechanism, they seem to have different tissue benefits. One of the, piperlongamine is from an Ayurvedic long pepper that had a lot of use with kidneys and lungs historically, right? So it's senolytic, but my sense is maybe it also has some tissue affinity.
Got it.
Given that long traditional use. I think when one of the polyphenols in olive leaves was identified as a senolytic, it was on chondrocytes, so joint cells, right? So my, I like to hedge my bets.
Yes.
I believe it's unlikely that any single senolytic compound is going to be as active in all tissues. Let's give broader support so we cover more bases.
Makes sense. So how many different ingredients do you have in the product?
We have 9 in there. One's called Synactive, which is a proprietary combination of sweet rose chestnut and a Panax ginseng, not Panax, Noto ginseng. And that one they've studied in muscle tissue.
Got it.
So I feel like, okay, we've got that in there for muscles. Fisetin, there was some activity in adipose tissue, quercetin in endothelial cells. The polyphenol from olive leaf in joint tissue. So let's again take this portfolio.
I like that. All your sounds like many of your products have a portfolio approach to them. Yeah. And so, is there a protocol for taking the product, the senolytic product? Are you taking it every day, or is it just on a week, off a week? Or
so that's a great question. Yeah. So this would be the box. There's going to be 12 capsules in that. And before I get to that, something can be senolytic, but the amount taken matters. Like Fisetin can be senolytic, but I often see supplements with maybe 100 milligrams of Fisetin in it, and then them it being positioned like, oh, we've got Fisetin in here as a senolytic. And in animal studies, you have to give a pretty large amount of these to have enough of an impact. And the reason we'll kind of just go off on a tangent before I get back to the dosing. So I mentioned that Fisetin, quercetin, at least one of their mechanisms is on cellular nutrient sensing pathways, right? And so have you ever heard of something called I think it's called the Fletcher-Weber law?
I'm not, no.
So named after, two people. I'm probably mispronouncing one or both of their names. But it's an old law. It goes back to the probably Civil War time period, like mid-1800s. And it was, bottom line is, it's about how our visual and auditory senses respond. And what, there's math equations, but they respond on what would be thought of as proportional change.
Okay.
So signal to noise ratio might be another way. So this way I've often described this on podcasts is imagine like when you go home tonight, you find the darkest closet in your home, go in there with no lights, and now, someone was to light one candle. Visually, you'd notice a big difference, right? Now, imagine you went into that same closet and for whatever reason, then the fire safety people will be mad, but there was 99 candles already lit and you light one candle, who cares, right? You may not even notice anything. So quantities don't matter for receptors. Change is what matters, right? Like not that quantities don't matter, but it's the change in things, right? If on a background of 2 candles, you lit one more in that space, that might create a big signal. But that, like with things like insulin resistance or leptin resistance or any of the hormones we talk about, the way I think about it, which may or may not be right, but there's receptors always listening for those compounds, right? And my guess would be those receptors play by the same physiological laws as our visual receptors and our auditory, right? It's proportional change. And proportional change, it's not just change, where proportional comes in is if the noise level of something is really high, we need a much louder signal, right? So think of a loud restaurant, you have to talk a lot louder. In a quiet environment, a softer thing can produce the same response. So the base and circadian would be an example. Like cortisol is a circadian, most hormones are, at least when we're young and have a healthy body clock. The low amount, somewhere around midnight for most of us, ideally, would be the noise level, like the baseline, right? And the surge above that is the signal, right? So I'll just make up numbers. So these aren't real numbers, but say at midnight, it should be 1 in the healthiest people, and at 7 to 9 a.m. it should be 20. That's a 20-to-1 proportional change. Now, we measure someone else, and they're stressed or whatever, and they're before bedtime cortisol is we'll just say 4,
Right.
right? What will we now have to have morning surge be to have that same proportional
It would have to be
change?
4 times as much, right?
Which would be 80, and then that would cause all kinds of damage.
Right.
Because that's way too much
Got
cortisol, right?
Yeah.
So when I think of hormones or anything where receptors are involved, we want to always get the noise level quieter and then create a really big signal.
Makes sense, yeah.
Right? And so the reason I'm telling that story is, so Fisetin, luteolin, and quercetin, look like they're working on those signaling pathways. So we want to create a massive change for the receptors paying attention.
Got it.
And one of the reasons, conversely, if we gave 100 milligrams of Fisetin every day, then that becomes the new noise level, right? Like, why should I keep paying attention to this? Because what we're really trying to do is get these cells to change their mind.
Sure.
So that's why, the dosing becomes infrequent or intermittent. It starts to make even physiologically a lot of sense. Take away the dasatinib toxicity issue. How would we convince something? Well, massive change in the environment is usually going to get our attention. So with the plant-based senolytics, the way we approach them at Qualia is take these things for 2 days, but in fairly large amounts, which translates into 6 capsules. 1 day, 6 capsules another would be a normal dosing cycle, and then have some window of a break from them.
Got it.
And then do that again. We want to create these waves of getting attention.
Yeah.
And the minimum that we've studied break between is take it 1 weekend, then skip all the way till 2 weekends from now, and then take it again.
Okay.
So, you'd be taking 2 cycles over a month.
Got it.
The way I take it, if I was working with someone, and I don't see patients right now, that was more historic, right? But if I was working with someone that already had issues and I was trying to get them managed better, I would take that approach.
Got it.
And do it, 2 cycles a month. The way I personally take it is the first weekend of every month. I don't normally take as many supplements on the weekend. So that weekend I just take Qualia Senolytic.
I see.
And
Makes
then,
sense.
I don't have to think hard. The first weekend of every month rolls around, Qualia Senolytic again.
Yeah.
And in a younger person, say someone, getting out of the Navy grad that was 28 or so, I might have had, for my age, more senescent cells than expected because of, going through some overhauls and high stress life and other things. That would be more like a quarterly fast approach, right? They likely weren't contributing anything, but do I want to maybe prune them away once in a while? Yeah. So that contextually, that's how I would think of it.
Makes sense.
More close together if you're trying to get something that's age related, under control, or do an N of 1 to see if it's helping that person. More spread out if it's more like a maintenance type thing. And again, when I was younger, I wasn't. I was much better at investing in my health than in my financial health, right?
Yeah.
And just like in a financial health sense, part of the reason we invest when we're younger is so older version of ourselves will be more comfortable and able to do more of what's important to them. And you and I would both know, and I'm sure some of the listeners would know that there's life expectancy, right? I think the latest is men, it's say 78, women, or men it's maybe 76, women it's 78. It's always a little high.
Yeah.
But there's something called life expectancy at 60, meaning you got to 60 years old, how much longer would you be on average expected to live now, which is more. The last time I saw it studied was around 2019, I think was the data, and it was published about a year and a half ago, and they lived, on average, say 83. So more, right? You make it to 60,
Make it to 60,
the average
you have a
goes
higher
higher.
chance of going up. Yep.
And then they also look at something called healthy life expectancy at 60. So how much of those years after 60 are you, really healthy, not disabled, not in assisted living, not affected with some disease that's really compromised here. And about a third of that 23 years that on average people were living was non-healthy. So healthy life expectancy hasn't really increased, right? And, you would know, I would know the time to improve that window isn't when we get to, 73, 74 and be like, oh, now I'll just start saving for, that time period. It's, in my way of thinking, like do more and start early.
Right.
So when I think of something like Quality Senolytic, one of the things, like I take it not because I'm trying to manage a current issue or expecting to feel something. If senescent cells are below a threshold in tissues, we won't feel anything. That's the nature of it. Just like allergies, we only, are allergic when we cross our threshold of tolerance.
Right.
But the way I think of it, if, just like 80-year-old Greg will be happy, younger Greg started investing financially, he'll be happier that I did more to invest in my health. And so for me, I very much think of Quality Senolytic as that investment that I'm optimistic, 80, 90-year-old Greg will look back and say, thank you for getting started on that early and being a better gardener for ourselves.
Yeah. Another great analogy. I love it. Well, these products that you have, where are they available? How can we get them? And how can we hear more of your analogies? How do we find more from you?
I might have used up any of my best. Anyways, qualialife.com. It's QUALIA, life, LIFE.com. We're really active on Instagram. So that's a great place for people if they want to just become more familiar with our content. We have lots of material on our website. When we launch a new product, I do a really long form blog that gives my thought process, often an analogy, like trying to set the table, and then, why I included each ingredient in a Qualia product, why I chose that specific amount to have, so, on our website, there'd be like a Qualia Senolytic ingredients might be the title of it, that, for someone that really wanted to do a deeper dive and get smarter, that would be the case. And then, I sometimes am a co-host on Collective Insights, which has been our Qualia branded podcast.
I think I'm supposed to be on your podcast in a few weeks.
Oh, fantastic. Sometimes it's Dan Stickler. He's an MD, is the host. Sometimes it's me. Our CEO, James, has been interviewing some people. I tend to get more like authors. I've read their book and it's like, can we get them on? I really want to talk with them. And I get a lot of the neuroscience people.
Got it. Good.
But those would be the best ways. And so Instagram, like I said, would be if you just wanted to get a flavor for, what we're really a company, the way I think of it, the founders wanted to make the world better and healthier, and supplements help them pay for education and other things that are really their mission. So
I love it. Well, this is fantastic. It was such a great conversation. I learned so much today, so I really appreciate you driving up here and making the show. And I can't wait to have more people learn more about the supplements that you're providing and the benefits that they do. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you, all the listeners, for sticking with us for this, hour and a half, 2 hours conversation.
Deep dive. It was a really good deep dive on brain supplements, gut supplements, and senolytic supplements. It's fantastic. Thank you.